So the name of today's presentation is The Evolution of Character Art at Guerrilla. And I made this presentation because last year Guerrilla celebrated their 20-year anniversary. So everybody got a bit nostalgic, including myself. So in this presentation I'll be covering my own journey, starting at Killzone Shadow Fall, then Horizon Zero Dawn, and Horizon Forbidden West. And on the next slide, a short video with some impressions how Guerrilla changed over those years. Some audio problems. Just imagine really exciting audio to hype it up. So that's Herman announcing Horizon. Everybody cheering in the crowd. Yeah. And then Forbidden West. Cool. And of course the VR game, almost forgot about that one. Yes, very. As you can see, that was quite a ride. So yeah, my name is Arno Schmitz. I'm currently lead character artist at Guerrilla. And during my 12 years, I shipped the following games. Killzone Shadow Fall, Horizon Zero Dawn, including the DLC, Forbidden West, including the DLC, The Burning Shores, and Call of the Mountain. A little bit about my background. I have a bachelor's degree from the Breda University of Applied Sciences, where I learned visual arts for games. This was my graduation project. Afterwards, I studied for a year at the Florence Academy of Art. For my personal work, I like to do fantasy characters like this knight or this cleric. And I also like to make portraits of my family, like my mom and dad and my grandma. So that's it. Let's get into the presentation itself. A little overview. First, we're going to go really deep into the texturing pipeline and how that changed over the projects. And then I'm going to be talking about how we create content at scale at Guerrilla. And then we're going to end with some lessons learned. And I'm going to warn you, I'm going to use the full hour. So if you have questions, just track me down outside and I'm happy to answer any of them. Next, let's talk a bit about the improvements to our texturing pipeline over my 12 years at Guerrilla. The evolution of the texturing pipeline and materials at Guerrilla goes hand in hand with PBR, physically based rendering. During the projects, you can see us coming to grips with these new concepts on Killzone, all the way to creating advanced layered shaders. When I joined Guerrilla, I was fresh out of school and I was very excited to find out we were working on a PS4 game, because back then we were in the era of PlayStation 3. I had wild ideas about using real-time displacement map on characters and stuff like that, but in the end I found out next gen was just going to be more of the same. It's just bigger resolution, normal maps, and more poly count. But the main thing that did change was the introduction of physically based rendering, PBR. So these were the terms I was familiar with back in the days. We have color, specular, gloss, and normal. And then suddenly we transitioned to PBR, and we were talking about things such as albedo, reflectance, roughness, and normal. And all these concepts are a lot more physically based. And around the time, there were a lot of guides around with these measured values for things like metals and dielectrics. And these were the guides. They served as baseline for our texturing pipeline. And then, of course, there's also the addition of detail maps. These are, in my opinion, what really makes the characters look next-gen. So let's break down how we did texturing on Killzone Shadow Fall, starting with an albedo map. Every map has 3 folders in a PSD, and we split out the color, the detail, and the lighting, as you can see from the naming. Visualizing that concept with transparent overlays, it would look something like this. So in Photoshop, all our albedos are sorted in this way. where we have flat fill layers with masks, and that allows us to very easily change the color in a very clean way. And these flat layers were inspired by all the flat color swatches we kept seeing in those many PBR guides. Why so many swatches? We found we can add a lot of extra richness to the plating by slightly changing the color. So for example, plates that are a little bit deeper into the character, we make them a little bit darker, for example. Then there was this magic software called Quixel, and it really helped us to level up our texturing. For those of you who don't know or forgot, this software allowed us to import all the baked maps, and then there were a whole bunch of presets that allowed us to add grime and wear to it. It was specifically good at adding these painted surfaces with metal scratches, and all these pre-made presets were perfect for the world of Killzone Shadow Fall. And of course, this entire tool was PBR, which was super useful. So we adopted Dido, and this whole color detail folder is dedicated to it. And we changed one thing though. Instead of opaque layers from Dido, we now make the bottom layer transparent. And this meant we can come in to our base layers and change the color, and everything will behave properly. And then finally, on top, we did a whole bunch of trickery by adding things such as ambient occlusion, cavity, and even some world space up lighting, all baked into the maps themselves, because in the early PBR days, the indirect lighting wasn't that accurate as it is nowadays, so we had to kind of help the textures along by baking in some of the lighting information. And even if this isn't physically correct, it did make the game look a lot better. And then here you can see the reflectance and roughness maps, all copying the exact same folder structure. It follows the same mindset that we did for the albedo, and it uses the Dido output for their respective detail folders. Then the other big aspect that really makes this game look next-gen are the detail maps. So if you look closely, we can see detail maps being used everywhere on this character. And this really allows us to get a lot more perceived resolution out of these textures and sell the idea of the various materials better. So what are detail maps exactly? They are little tileable textures, usually 256 or 512, and they come as a pair. The grayscale map gets overlaid on top of the albedo, and sometimes the reflectance, and the normal map gives the illusion of elevation. These detail maps get masked out by a mask. Here you can see the red, green, and blue channel are using each to mask a region out, giving us 3 detail maps in total. And you can see we even add a lot of grayscale values in there. This helps to adjust the intensity and helps to sell the areas of wear and seams better. So as a conclusion, we have physically based rendering, we have procedural texturing from Dido, and we have detail maps. And that's pretty much the texturing workflow for Killzone Shadow Fall. And overall, that was quite successful, but we know moving forward that we had to expand the system, because 3 detail maps was quite limited, because we already found for some hero characters that we had to make a second shader just to get 6 detail maps. Moving into the world of Horizon Zero Dawn, we had a much bigger palette of materials we needed to cover. So we went ahead and started to brainstorm about possible improvements. As a reminder, this is where we were at the end of Killzone Shadow Fall, and this is where we're going for Horizon Zero Dawn. There's also a big improvement in the lighting system, so we decided to do a lot less baking into the albedos. And we also went from 3 detail maps to 8. And just as with Killzone Shadow Fall, let's jump into a PSD and see how that's structured and what that tells about our workflow. So you can see the structure is very similar. We still have the base colors, which are flat, and we still have the Dido detail maps for the procedural details. But you can see there's a lot more slots in there, because there's a lot more different material types. And also notice the PSD, which now contains only the color information, Because the PSDs became so big, we had to each split them into a separate file. And you can see here the same logic again for the Dido group, just a lot more folders because there's a lot more different materials. Instead of using out-of-the-box presets from Quixel like we did on Killzone, we now made a completely custom library during the pre-production of Horizon Zero Dawn. And here you can see that complete library we produced during that time. We had a very good documentation with all kinds of cool concepts and reference pictures, and the goal was to copy all the material behaviors and distill them down into presets. So this is, for example, linen. Now we have buckskin, which is used on a lot of Nora outfits. Leather had multiple presets to capture the many different states it can be in. This is, for example, leather damage, where you can see we're using the cavity and AO to kind of drive the edge wear on the character. Wood is the best example showing the transparent nature of these presets. It's very obvious here that the blue color is what's part on the flat swatch, and all those wooden edges, those are part of the Dido preset. And then here we have the machine plate, which always looks super awkward when applied to the complete character, because all the maps are tuned to really pick up those hard angles that are in our machine plates. On top of that, we have 3 general presets: dust, dirt, and staining. And these provide additional texture detail that help to make the characters feel more grounded into the world. And often we use the world space gradients to make sure the dirt only gets applied on like the feet and then fade out on the lower legs. Back to our layered PSD, and we can see here again all those Dido presets in the folder structure. And since the lighting improved that much between Killzone and Horizon, we decided to not bake in any of the lighting anymore, but instead the color detail folder now contains all the bespoke texturing. We found that relying only on procedural texturing didn't give enough life and storytelling to the characters, so that's what we did here by hand. So things like armpit stains or knee pads, scuff marks, things like that, artists painted in by hand. Then here, a little bit of an example of how effective this system is. So here we have one of the Aloy outfits, and then just by changing those flat colors below, you can see all the details still behave naturally, and we just have a completely new look for the outfit. Then for the detail maps, we went from 3 to 8 by doing some fancy shader math, using the overlapping areas between the 3 primary colors to get 8 masks out of a single RGB texture. It's kind of like booleans, but for color. As a result, a detail map mask now looks something like this instead of the RGB one. And this will give us 8 regions, but the other one had intensity. So we now have an additional map called the MISC map, where the R channel drives the intensity of all the detail maps. And then it means we have 2 additional channels. So green drove 2 additional masks. So we have white for skin and black for fur, and that allows us to give things like subsurface scattering and also just have 2 extra detail maps. And the blue channel drives translucency. This is the effect when you backlight thin objects and the light shines through. And that's here seen on the skirt of Aloy, where the light comes from the back. One thing that we had to keep in mind at all times was our pixel density, because the pixel density in this open world game was super low. We just had 4 pixels per centimeter, so if you just look at your own fingernail, that's probably 4 by 4 pixels. That meant we had to avoid high contrast, small details like thin lines or graphical elements, because when you downsample the textures, all those details will look very blurry. Same goes for very noisy details. They will just fade away with all the downsampling. And this meant we had to rely really heavily on detail maps to achieve our high-res look. We also have this other technique that really helped to raise the quality called tiling trims, and you can see it very clearly on the necklace. So tiling trims are usually a sheet that contains just tileable textures vertically, and we just take the target areas which are too low res, and we map the UVs to this texture instead, and this allows us to get all the high-res detail we want. And obviously, this texture is more than 4 pixels per centimeter. We just tried to pack it as effectively as possible, so the density varied. And then here, another look at the detail map set. For Horizon, we decided to use more organic detail maps based on photos and scans instead of the more synthetic maps for Killzone. And here an example of all those techniques in action on Aloy's skirt. So I'm just going to reveal all the trickery here. If you select the trims and you throw them away, you can see the actual texture resolution. And then here, the detail maps are gone, revealing the actual texture resolution. So if I just come back, you can see how much that helps. The final things that really elevated the material expression in Horizon is that for all those 8 detail map areas, they could also mask out specific shader effects. So we could mask out Fresnel for clothing to get some more fuzzy edges. And we could also mask out anisotrophy, which really helped for Aloy's scarf, but also a lot of the Karja outfits are using this. So then a little conclusion for the Zero Dawn texturing pipeline. So we're still using procedural texturing with Dido. We have now 8 detail maps. We have the ability to define areas that have anisotrophy or Fresnel. We're adding tileable trims to add a lot more detail. We have the ability to define translucency, and we also have a dedicated channel for skin and fur. The main con of this approach is that by continuously adding more functionality to the character shader throughout production, we ended up with this really elaborate shader. It just keeps on going. Scrolling down this list, you can see how many variables there were to manipulate, and this made it very not user-friendly for new hires, and also not that friendly for the performance. That's why for Horizon Forbidden West, we decided to rethink our approach, starting to work with a new layered material workflow. And again, just like before, we're going to do a quick recap. So at the start of Forbidden West, we were doing albedo, reflectance, roughness, and normal. We had 8 detail maps. We had 8 detail map regions, and we had that MISC map to control the intensity, translucency, and skin and fur. So then here I'm just going to combine the workflows to kind of give you analogies here. With Zero Dawn on the left, Forbidden West on the right. So the traditional maps, such as albedo, reflectance, roughness, are now gone. They are essentially embedded into the 8 materials and are controlled directly in the shader. We still rely on baked out data maps marked in blue to get all the information from the high poly. And we still need a map to drive those 8 material regions. So instead of detail maps, a map with exactly the same logic now drives the materials. And the MISC map now controls the properties which give us a much more control about the whole system, since these properties can change per material, and we're going to go into detail what that means exactly. Another thing we did was to split up the textures into smaller chunks. So instead of having Aloy's costume in one texture sheet, we now split it up into, for example, like the torso, the bracers, and the skirt. And this helped to make the whole system more modular and also helped to not reach that 8 material limit. Another big switch was our use of software. Substance Painter offered more customizability and a range of smarter tools. 3D painting within the viewport and full support for custom-made materials made in Substance Designer. So all of this made us switch over from Dido to Substance Painter at the beginning of the project. So as a visual representation, during the Horizon Zero Dawn days, we used a map to mask out 8 different detail map regions, like we discussed already. And now for Forbidden West, we're using a similar map to mask out 8 different material regions. We actually bake an ID map with a lot more colors than those 8, and this will give us fine-grained control over every single element in the texture. And then we assign in Substance Painter, and this will allow us to really refine those 8 material regions. So on a side-by-side, you can see the ID mask that we actually bake during the baking stage, and then the material mask of those 8 regions on the right. Once all the material regions are defined, we can drag them into the material, and we can drag a material onto the region and start texturing. And for all of these, we have complete parity between the shaders in Substance Painter and in our own engine, Decima. And for this project, a huge material library got created under the supervision of Daniel Guterres, 98 for the main game and 3 extra ones for the Burning Shores DLC. And all these materials are created in Substance Designer, and we found this was the only way to keep the maps that drive the detail synchronized. For Horizon Zero Dawn, we mainly use scanned and photographic maps to drive the detail, but when we tried to do the same for this system, we noticed it was extremely hard to line up all the different detail maps, all the different states of them. And it's also very hard in real life to find materials in a very pure state, like completely rusted or completely pristine. Usually in real life, materials are always a mix of multiple. So creating them in Substance Designer allowed us to make these pure textures that match with each other perfectly. And for every material, we have 3 states: pristine, damaged, and weathered. So a big part of the production process was to build up a system with a custom library, very similar to what we did on Zero Dawn. And the way the states get interpreted could vary from material to material, leading to a lot more meaningful material expression than the previous game. So here again we have buckskin. Then for leather is a pretty straightforward example where the pristine is just leather as we know it. The damage reveals the suede, and the weathering kind of gives this black, oily feel to it. For copper, for example, where pristine is just copper, then damage is kind of dented, scratched version, and weathering adds all the patina and rust. And then for plastic, seen on a lot of the machine cables, the damage actually exposes the copper wiring within, and again, the robot plate, which looks super awkward as usual, and then is fine-tuned specifically to hit all these edges on the machine plates. And all those material states are being driven by the MISC map, and the MISC map now looks something like this. So instead, on Zero Dawn, where it was driving arbitrary shader values such as detail map intensity, translucency, stuff like that, it now controls the material states, since the above-mentioned properties are now baked into the materials themselves. And that means the materials, this map is now packed like this, with red for damage, green for dirt, and blue for weathering. That means in Substance Painter, for every material, there's a smart preset that will automatically apply the correct type of damage, dirt, and weathering for the material. And then after the smart material is applied, an artist can come in and add hand-painted details to add additional storytelling to the costume. To enable this process, a lot of work happened on the back end by our graphics programmers and technical artists to make sure we have consistent visuals in our authoring software and our engine. Then moving to our engine, Decima, here our layered shader and how it gets assembled. So instead of having that Uber shader in Maya with the endless list of variables, the shader is now essentially a block that gets input all the texture information, and then we can just plug in a material for every node, and you can see the color. And then on the top right, you can see we have color information if you select one of those nodes. Then in this time lapse, I can show you how we can easily change this Osram character going from its natural brown palette to a more evil palette with black letters and green fabrics, just by playing with those 3 solid colors at the top. But we can go way beyond just changing the colors of the materials. By swapping out some materials, we can give this character a completely new look. So first we swap out the iron for bronze, and next we're going to start changing the letters for fish letters to get a drastically different feel. And lastly, we can change the green linen for the crochet to complete the transformation and give this character more of a Quen type material palette. That's a different tribe in the game. So look at that, now it's just a completely different feel to the character. We also got a lot of mileage out of a feature called dyes, and here you can see how that works on the Aloy costumes. And dyes are just a lookup table of 8 pixels that can be hooked up to the shader. So it's literally just a texture of 8 pixels that can override different colors in the material. This is how it works. For every single material, we can have just a static color, or it can reference to one of the 8 pixels on the die. And this way we can set a default color when there's no dye applied, because the dyes get applied per character variant in the game, not per material. And on these Osram civilians, you can see how that looks by applying both some dyes and changing some geometry assets. We can have a very well-varied population in a certain settlement. And the Quen, they are more structured, so they are all wearing exactly the same garment, so you can see how effective the dyes are to add some variation. And the guy in the middle without the things above its head, he's just using the default static colors in the shader. Next, I want to talk a little bit about pilling. This is a material feature exclusive to the PlayStation 5. And similar to the peach fuzz on the face, we wanted to do something on the costume to help break the silhouette of the organic fuzzy materials. And this is based on a real-life effect, and the pilling is the result of normal wear and tear. They're broken clothing fibers on the surface that become tangled together. And here you can see how we replicated that feel on Seika's scarf. Again, in our engine Decima, for every material node that makes sense, you can turn on the isFuzz variable, and this will trigger a Houdini process that will populate the particular materials area with fuzz. And fuzz is rendered as a bunch of camera-facing sprites evenly across the surface, and these cards have a random alpha applied from the set, and the relevant set is chosen based on the material that's there. So for example, wool will have more of a soft alpha, and burlap will have more of a rough alpha. So then a conclusion for the Forbidden West shading pipeline. We have a layered material system, we have 8 material regions, we have procedural texturing, now switched to substance, we have material behaviors integrated into the shader with the 3 states per materials. We're still using the tiling trim techniques to add additional detail. We added dyes, we added pilling, and it was very easy to expand the system at any time. And it was also a lot more easy to upgrade the shaders at any time. And to wrap up this chapter, it's good to observe the overall trend of the projects getting more physically based. And this is mainly due to our render tech improvement. And you can also see less and less reliance on full textures and more usage of smaller textures and layer techniques. And by embracing a more modular system with layered shaders, we were able to keep adding and improving materials throughout the production, removing the need to lock shader decisions very early on, or to take a hit on refactoring a lot of assets when we decided to change something. Okay, 50% in. I talked at length about our shaders. But of course, those shaders need to be applied on the characters. Guerrilla is known for making that set, for making new benchmarks that can be achieved on PlayStation hardware, and for that, individual assets need to look as good as they can be. But moving to an open world, we had to balance the need of individual impressive assets with the need to populate an entire open world. So for every big topic like this, we're just going to jump back, starting all the way in chronological order with Killzone. This is when I joined Guerrilla. And as you can see here, we have the Helgast, Assault Trooper, Security Guard, and Sniper, and they're just completely bespoke assets. Even the Helgast Terrorist, which are essentially variants, are just two completely separate models, no modular system. And then there were a few areas in the game that had us walking through crowds, so we needed more variation. So we needed to create content in a more optimized way. So we have, for example, the same pants and jacket, different jackets, and a lot of accessories like hoodies and scarves. And this allowed us to create, with a minimal amount of content, just enough variation to have a believable crowd. And that's pretty much all the modularity there was in the Killzone games. But in the meantime, we were also already working hard on Horizon Zero Dawn, just a small team. At the time, it was looking something like this, and you can already see that we have Aloy and we have Meridian City, and you can see there's a need for crowds and multiple characters. So we had to start to think about modular character design. Our goal regarding quality was something like this. So we wanted to aim for dialogues like we've seen in our favorite RPGs, and the characters need to be held up during conversations like this, and be able to see all the cool detail we put on these characters. And then, of course, there was also the introduction of photo mode, which really helped to push our quality even higher, because we noticed people like to do these extreme close-ups. But during your average playthrough, most of the time, characters get actually seen like this. And for this, variation is very important, not seeing a bunch of clones on screen. So for this, it's very important to focus on things like the silhouette, the color blockout, the internal shapes, and material choices. So how we approach filling this open world is by breaking the characters down into 3 categories. We have Aloy, story characters, and NPCs. For Aloy, we put a lot of effort into making nice-looking, unique outfits, usually associated with a strong team, like a tribe or a machine. For Zero Dawn, we actually had a little bit of modularity, usually in light, medium, heavy, of the same costume. And this was done by either adding or removing parts, and these parts were all on their little texture, so we didn't mess around with any wasted UV space. And this is my favorite set from Zero Dawn, and you can clearly see how by adding elements, we just make the set heavier. Moving on to our second category, the story characters. We decided to make them very late into the game because the story department kept developing. We wanted to make sure we had enough time to do them justice. So for example, Rost here, at the beginning, this is actually the shipped reveal trailer, is just a generic Nora Hunter, which was the closest NPC that resembled the story. And it's good we took this approach because in the beginning of the story, Ross was more of like a warrior berserker type guy, and in the end, he ended being like the father figure to Aloy. So if we would have made the Rost model too early on, it wouldn't have quite fit the story we were trying to tell for him. There we go. Another example is Errant, which is the captain of the Osram Vanguard. So during most of the story, he actually just looked like on the left, like just the Osram Vanguard, and then near the end, we made a few assets to just make him a little bit more unique and draw more attention to the actor's face. So we removed the helmet, we gave him the scarf, we gave him a different arm thingy, and we also gave him very bespoke facial hair and like a earring. The last category are the NPCs, and we decided to split them into archetypes, and we had to define what an archetype was for every tribe in the game. So for the Karja, for example, that tribe is very hierarchical, so we could split them into rich and poor, while for the Nora, we looked at what function the character had within the group. So here we have the mother, the child, the hunter, and the matriarch. And how the archetypes work is that they are a set of different components, and these components can only mix and match within the archetype. So for example, the matriarch components can only mix and match within the matriarchs, so not with the mother, even if they're the same gender. And this allowed us to have very different body shapes per archetype, and allowed us to have different split lines per costume parts, and it allowed us to have maximum variation in the shape, language, and silhouette between the different archetypes. And here we're going to zoom into the matriarch, and usually the concept art team makes a whole bunch of variants. Usually they make dozens of these, and together with art direction, it gets narrowed down to a list of components. And we call this list of components the paper doll, and it's a 2D representation, usually a layered PSD, and here we plan out the modularity. And here you can see all the components for the Nora matriarch on display. So we have a base body, we have a bunch of helmets, we have shoulder pieces, torso pieces, and some arm accessories. And as you can see, it's a lot of assets, and every single one of these components adds another draw call during runtime without making that much impact, so it was actually quite heavy on performance. That's why for Forbidden West, we decided to go with a lot bigger, more distinct components, but a lot less of them. So in this Osram lineup, we just have 4 tops and 4 pants, but they're all more distinct. And this led to better performance because there's less draw calls, there's just fewer components. Then after the 3D production, you end up with something like this as a set. And these are the components that can be mix and match within each other. This is like one Osram archetype. And here you can see an example of those assembled. And you can see all of them using the exact same body type, which leads us nicely into our next subtopic, the base body. And this allowed us to create different body shapes for all the archetypes. Going back all the way to Killzone Shadow Fall again, I managed to actually dig up the old base bodies. And as you can see here, they're really just to dictate the proportions. They're not that well defined, but it worked for the game because usually they're all heavily covered in military gear, and at the most you see the faces. But for Horizon, we knew we wanted to get back to basics and make a new set of base bodies. From my time in Florence, I know how important anatomy is, so correct proportions and anatomy is what we focus on. We also added the child, because unlike the grim world of Horizon, the open world of Horizon also has children. So we reached out to Scott Eaton, who is the industry expert when it comes to anatomy, to bring some anatomy knowledge to the team. And for those of you who don't know who Scott is, he's the person in the blue shirt. At the beginning of production, we had a 1-week course in Amsterdam, and he helped us to give everybody the basics of anatomy. And this is for all character-related artists, so also riggers, animators, etc. And then after the course, we kept working with Scott with regular video feedback to make sure all our work was on point. Moving forward to Forbidden West, we decided to lean heavier into scan data. So as you can see here, we're really respecting the proportions of the game before, but we redid all the surfacing based on scan data to create a lot more naturalistic bodies. And you also notice the guy on the left, he's called the Heavy, and we added him to expand the combat, because for machines, we kind of have this whole David versus Goliath aspect, and we wanted to have a similar feeling when fighting humans. Behind the scenes, we're using one logical skeleton, and we have 4 different skeletal proportions for the Heavy, male, female, and child. And why only 4? This allows for maximum amount of animation sharing without any retargeting. For gameplay reasons, it's very important that these characters have the same proportions for things such as reaches and walk speeds. And this means the variations, such as extremely muscled or skinny, all need to work on the same skeletal proportions, and it's up to us as the artist to sell the illusion that these characters are substantially different. So this is how that's structured. We have the normal person in the middle, and then we have the 4 extremes: fat, muscle, old, and skinny. And now that I made you aware of it, you can see they all respect the same skeletal proportions. And once we have our extremes, we can morph in between in ZBrush, and this is the basis of how we create all the variants for our game. What's essential for the blending to work correctly is that the sculpted detail is mapped to the correct part of the topology. And a key part of that is done during the authoring stage, where we have this little colored texture to make sure all the skeletal landmarks are on the right spot. And this ensures correct blending and predictable skinning. And here you can see the end result of that work. The topology is shared per gender, and this is how we can transfer skinning and other information from one character to the other. And compared to Horizon Zero Dawn, we up-res areas such as the hand and shoulders, and we spend a lot of time talking to our rigging department to find both the correct topological flow for rigging, but also the correct density that made sure the topology held up when we're switching to these more extreme body types. Here a little recipe for that Osram civilian that I talked about a little bit earlier. So we have our ideal guy, and then we blend in quite a bit of fat, but the Osram are usually also quite strong, so they have very muscular arms. And these body types are created by mixing the extremes in ZBrush and then doing additional sculpting on top to kind of touch it up. And all this blending and mixing is not done in real time, but they're all made offline on the content side. And that leaves us with a library of base bodies for each game. Here on display are all the variants for Zero Dawn, and for Forbidden West we have approximately 10 more. And we didn't plan these base bodies out at the beginning of production, we just tried to anticipate the ones we need, and then throughout production we can add unexpected body types in short notice because we have this whole morphing system. It allows us to really quickly create new bodies. Continuing on, I want to share with you what we did to improve the skin. It's another great thing to focus on to raise the visual quality because improvements here affect every single character in the game. For each costume component in Zero Dawn, we copied the base body and we just slice off the geometry that gets covered by the outfit. And then for the skin, we just put the UVs somewhere on the texture map and we transfer all the textures over. This was quite good for performance because that meant a component like this is just one draw call because it's all one shader. The cons are that these base bodies need to be locked very early on in production because for every texture we need to bake over all those texture data to that new UV set. And this made iterating later on very time intensive because if we wanted to make changes to the texture information on the skin, we had to rebake all that to all these different UV spaces. So for Forbidden West, we decided to do it like this. We're still chopping away everything of the base body that is not necessary, but we're keeping it on its original UVs, and that means we also just have a separate material that samples straight from the skin texture. And this left us with a lot more flexibility and allowing us to keep iterating on both the skin shader and the skin texture throughout production, and all the characters will just benefit from those improvements. That means all the characters of the same gender now have the same shared UVs for the skin. So we have shared UVs for male, female, and child, and the heavy archetype just uses the male UVs and textures. And this allows us to exchange a lot of different information between body types. It also allows us to create new variants very quickly So here are all the extreme body types. So if we want to have, for example, 50% muscle, 50% fat, we can just take those complete texture sets, blend them, and have a new texture set that's ready to go. And of course, the game is full of things such as body paint and tattoos, and all those things you can just create once and share across all the characters because they have the same UVs. Then here, just a comparison between Horizon Zero Dawn on the left and Forbidden West on the right. And you can see with the introduction of scan data for the sculpt and more photographic textures and also better detail maps, how much delta we can create between the skin. And in this comparison, I want to focus on the tattoos. Again, because on Zero Dawn we had to bake the texture down into that more limited UV space, it doesn't quite have the texel density to support what we're trying to do, while with its own dedicated UV space, we actually do have the sharpness we need. Also want to draw your attention to the white face paint, where you can kind of have some depth to it. Sorry, the body paint. And this was achieved with this device. Bart Walhout, one of our character artists, built this homebrew 3D scanner and allowed us to scan all the different types of swatches. And the outputs of the scans always look something like this. So it's a set of matching normals and alphas that we can use to build up face paint. And it's really cool that we end up using this library also for other things than just the characters. So also in the UI, on the machines, and in the environment. So this collection actually helped to tie the visual style of the game together. So it led to this type of result. You can clearly see the purple, pink face paint. But you can also see the white, dusty face paint. The crackling behavior of that was inspired by some reference pictures we took from Ashley Birch wearing some face paint during some scans. And for those of you who don't know who that is, she's the performance capture artist for Aloy. And we're using the cavity map of each individual head to influence the transparency of the face paint. And this way, the unique wrinkles per person will carry over through the face paint, and this will help to hide the reuse we're doing with those face paints. This is another thing that can only be achieved because we have consistent UVs on every single face in the game. Besides the face paint, we also make extensive use of decals, and these are essentially little stickers that we can move around very precisely, and we use them to add storytelling, such as dirt and wounds. Another big topic we focused on was skin recoloring between Zero Dawn and Forbidden West, and here you can see a lineup of Osram arms from Zero Dawn, and for this we used a color ramp to recolor the albedo, leading to this flat look. In total, we had 9 different skin tones in the game, and since the heads didn't have a recolor system, we just had to bake them all down to these flat colors. And then, for example, if we got a texture from a head, that's Varl there on the left from a vendor, we had to manually match it. So usually those textures came in too bright because they weren't calibrated, so we had to find the closest skin tone in the game, and then we had to put an alpha on it and match it so there's no visual seam. And then an artist had to come in and kind of eyeball the color until it matched properly. And of course, this process is super subjective and was led to some mistakes. Was also very easy to mismatch the color by a shade to kind of get this kind of weird mismatches on the neckline. So we had a lot of bugs near the end of production regarding this. So for Forbidden West, we decided to change the process. For skin textures, we are now storing our albedo in this gray-looking format, that you can see on the left, because we have extracted the average skin tone out of the textures, leaving only the local skin variation. And then this map serves to offset the skin lookup table, which is that one, which holds the average skin tones used in the game. And this leads to way better discoloration than the first game. And we also doubled the amount of skin tones compared to the first game this way. And since the skin tones are now set with a variable for both the head and body, it's impossible to get a mismatch between the head and body. The skin tone lookup table isn't a simple multiply or gradient map like the first game. You saw the vertical axis. That is controlled by a melanin map, we call it, and this is where we can set different types of melanin in different regions. So if we change to a different skin tone, you can see that very pronounced on the hands. And for the Burning Shores DLC, we even add the option to have custom melanin maps for specific individuals, leading to cool characters like this. The main thing I want you to take away from this very long topic is that if you have limited resources, focus your efforts on things that have the highest impact. The improvements we did on the base bodies, skin, and texturing will ripple through every single character on screen. Then we really focus a lot on modularity. This way we can make a big amount of characters with a smaller set of components and mix and match them. This can be seen in how we tackled the archetype system. We just allowed the mixing within an archetype, and this way we can keep the distinct differences between, for example, an Osram civilian and a Nora matriarch. And the same modular mindset got applied to a more technical level. Look at what we managed to achieve with shared UVs. It unlocks the reuse of body paint, tattoos, and also skin tones. In this presentation, we just witnessed 12 years of game production, and there's a lot to learn from this. The first takeaway is to make effective use of modular components. So instead of going really big and adding lots of components, creating a very complicated system that works for all characters, it's best to take a look at what the project really needs and have a small group of components that works well with each other. And we call this group archetypes. By keeping the modularity confined, the specific archetypes, we were able to get maximum visual differences between the different NPCs. Having to create such a huge amount of content for an open world, it's really hard to know what to prioritize. It's best to place your efforts on assets that can be reused a lot of the times, or assets that serve as the basis of other assets, such as base bodies. This way, your efforts will ripple through all the character content. By having shared UVs on both the base bodies and the head, we managed to set up elaborate systems for body paints, face paints, and melanin systems. And small textures, small tiling textures are your friends when it comes to creating detail up close. And during the projects, our techniques became more and more sophisticated, going from 3 detail maps with simple masking on Killzone to 8 detail maps with complicated masking in Zero Dawn, all the way to our current modern layered shader system. And we had to deal with the growing shader complexity on Horizon Zero Dawn with our Uber shader. It had a lot of cool features, but was really expensive. While for Forbidden West, we have our layered material in Decima, where we can plug in up to 8 materials. So if we have a material that just requires 3, we can just plug in 3, and the material becomes a lot more cheaper and better optimized, and this way, we have much better control over how we optimize our content. And that's it for all the takeaways. I like to end all my presentations showing a few cool pictures from photo mode, because it's really rewarding to see what the fan base does and that they actually pay attention to all the cool detail we put into our models. So for example, these close-up shots. Same goes for our cosplayers that really take a look at what we did and recreate it beautifully in real life. And that's it for the presentation today. If you'd like to get in touch because you want to know more, or you have cool ideas on how to improve our pipeline or our character models in general, please feel free to reach out during one of these methods. And with that said, thank you for all your attention, and I'll now take questions probably outside of the room because I took all the time. Thank you very much.